June 28th, 1914, a date that would forever divide human history into before and after. In the morning light of Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary adjusted his military uniform one final time, unaware that he had fewer than 4 hours to live. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne had awakened to what seemed like any other state visit. The summer sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Bosnia's capital, where banners and decorations hung from every window. The local authorities had spared no expense in preparing for the Archduke's arrival. This was to be a celebration of imperial unity, a demonstration of Habsburg power in the restless Balkans. But beneath the festive atmosphere, something sinister was already in motion. 6 young men had risen that morning with murder on their minds. They had spent weeks planning, training, and positioning themselves along the route that Franz Ferdinand's motorcade would take through the city. Each carried weapons provided by a shadowy organization known as the Black Hand, and each was prepared to die for their cause. Franz Ferdinand himself was no stranger to controversy. At 50 years old, he was a complex figure, a man who advocated for giving more autonomy to the Slavic peoples within the empire, yet represented the very system that many Bosnians viewed as foreign occupation. His marriage to Sophie, a Czech countess considered beneath his station, had already scandalized the imperial court. Today, she would accompany him on what was supposed to be their 14th wedding anniversary celebration. As the Archduke's train pulled into Sarajevo station at 9:28 a.m., local officials greeted him with the pomp and ceremony befitting an heir to one of Europe's great empires. The planned route would take the motorcade through the heart of the city, past government buildings, through narrow streets lined with cheering crowds, and finally to the town hall, where speeches and ceremonies awaited. What Franz Ferdinand didn't know was that intelligence reports had already warned of potential threats. The provincial governor had received word that Serbian nationalists might attempt something during the visit, but the warnings were vague, and security remained surprisingly light. Only 120 policemen had been assigned to protect the future emperor along a route that stretched several miles through hostile territory. The motorcade consisted of 6 cars. The Archduke and his wife would ride in the third vehicle, a 1911 Graf stiff double phaeton, an open-top car that offered excellent visibility for the crowds, but no protection whatsoever for its occupants. The decision to use an open car would prove fatally consequential. At 10:10 a.m., the procession began its journey into the city. Franz Ferdinand waved to the crowds, many of whom genuinely cheered for the man who had promised reform and greater self-governance. Sophie, radiant in her white dress and wide-brimmed hat, smiled and acknowledged the well-wishers lining the streets. Neither could see the young men who had positioned themselves at strategic points along the route, their weapons hidden, their resolve hardened by months of nationalist fervor and secret meetings. The first assassin, Muhammad Mehmed Basic, stood near the Miljacka River Bridge, a bomb in his coat pocket. But as the motorcade approached, his nerve failed him. The crowds were too thick. A policeman stood too close. The moment passed. The second conspirator, Nedeljko Kabranovic, waited further along the route near the central police station. At 19 years old, he was one of the youngest members of the plot, but his commitment to the cause of South Slavic independence burned as fiercely as any veteran revolutionary. As the Archduke's car approached, Kabranovic felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the moment that would change everything. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows on the cobblestones where history would soon be written in blood. To understand the hatred that would soon explode on a Sarajevo street, one must first descend into the labyrinth of Balkan politics in 1914, a world where ancient grievances festered like untreated wounds, and where secret societies plotted revolution in shadowed cafes. Bosnia-Herzegovina had been under Austro-Hungarian occupation since 1878, formally annexed in 1908 against the furious protests of neighboring Serbia. For many Bosnian Serbs, this represented not liberation from Ottoman rule, but merely the exchange of one foreign master for another. The Habsburg double-headed eagle was seen as no less oppressive than the Ottoman crescent had been. In Belgrade, the capital of independent Serbia, a clandestine organization had formed with a single burning purpose: the creation of a greater Serbia that would unite all South Slavic peoples under one crown. They called themselves Ujedinjenje ili Smrt, Union or Death. The world would know them by their more sinister name, the Black Hand. Led by Colonel Dragutin Dimitrijevic, known by the codename Apis, the Black Hand had already orchestrated the brutal assassination of Serbia's King Alexander and Queen Draga in 1903. Dimitrijevic was a bear of a man with penetrating eyes and an unshakable belief that violence was not just acceptable but necessary to achieve Serbian unity. His organization operated like a spider's web throughout the Balkans, recruiting young idealists and providing them with weapons, training, and targets. The 6 young men now waiting in Sarajevo were products of this system. Gavrilo Princip, the most dedicated of the group, was just 19 years old, a slight, tubercular boy who compensated for his physical frailty with an iron will and absolute commitment to the nationalist cause. Born into a peasant family in the remote village of Oboljic, Princip had witnessed firsthand the poverty and resentment that Austrian rule had brought to his people. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. Princip's radicalization had begun in his teenage years when he moved to Sarajevo for school. There, in the coffee houses and student meetings, he encountered the intoxicating ideology of South Slavic nationalism. He read the works of revolutionary thinkers, debated politics late into the night, and gradually transformed from a country boy into a would-be assassin. The other conspirators shared similar backgrounds. Nedeljko Kabranovic worked in a printing shop and had already been arrested once for participating in anti-Austrian demonstrations. Trifko Grabez was a teacher's son whose moderate family had no idea of his radical activities. Vaso Kubrilovic was only 17, the youngest of the group, yet already committed to dying for the cause, if necessary. The Black Hand had provided them with 4 Browning pistols and 6 bombs, small, handheld devices filled with nails and metal fragments designed to maximize casualties. The weapons had been smuggled across the Serbian border through a network of farmers, innkeepers, and sympathizers who formed an underground railroad for revolutionary materials. Training had taken place in secret locations around Belgrade. The young conspirators learned to shoot, to handle explosives, and most importantly, to steel themselves for the moment when they would need to take human lives. They were told that if captured, they should swallow cyanide capsules to avoid revealing information under torture. Death was preferable to betrayal, but there was a deeper psychological element to their preparation. These young men had been convinced that they were not committing murder, but performing a sacred duty. Franz Ferdinand was not seen as a human being with a wife and children, but as a symbol of oppression, a representative of everything that kept their people in chains. To kill him would be an act of liberation, a blow struck for freedom itself. The morning of June 28th carried special significance beyond the Archduke's visit. It was Vidovdan St. Vitus Day, a date sacred in Serbian history as the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, when Serbian forces had fallen to the Ottomans. For centuries, this day had symbolized both defeat and the promise of eventual resurrection for the Serbian people. As the conspirators took their positions along the motorcade route, each carried not just weapons, but the weight of centuries of historical grievance. They were no longer individuals, but instruments of fate, believing themselves chosen to strike the blow that would finally free their people from foreign domination. The stage was set, the players in position. History held its breath. The 6 assassins moved through Sarajevo's mourning crowds like ghosts among the living, each carrying death in his pocket and destiny in his heart. By 10 a.m., they had taken their positions along the Apel Quay, the broad boulevard that ran parallel to the Miljacka River where Franz Ferdinand's motorcade would pass. The mastermind behind this coordinated attack was not among them. Colonel Dimitrijevic remained safely in Belgrade, his fingerprints nowhere to be found on the weapons or the plot. This was the Black Hand signature, using idealistic young men as expendable tools while the leadership maintained plausible deniability. The 6 conspirators were, in essence, human bullets fired by a gun they would never see. Muhammad Mehmed Basic, positioned near the Kamerja Bridge, clutched his bomb with sweating palms. A 27-year-old carpenter from Herzegovina, he was the oldest of the group and arguably the most experienced. Yet as the morning progressed and crowds thickened around him, doubt began to creep into his mind. The police presence was heavier than expected, and innocent civilians packed the sidewalks. Children waved small Austrian flags, unaware that they stood mere feet from a man contemplating mass murder. Further down the route, Nedeljko Kabranovic waited near the Austro-Hungarian bank building. Unlike Mehmed Basic, the young printer showed no signs of wavering. He had already been arrested once for throwing stones at Austrian officials during a previous demonstration. His hatred for the empire burned pure and undiluted. Today, he told himself, would be different from throwing stones. Today would matter. Vaso Kubrilovic, barely old enough to shave, stood near the Latiner Bridge. At 17, he was technically still a child, yet the Black Hand had seen fit to arm him with a Browning pistol and trust him with a mission that could alter the course of European history. His youth worked as camouflage. Who would suspect a teenage student of harboring such deadly intentions? Kujetko Popovich, 18 years old and a student at the commercial school, had positioned himself near the town hall where the official ceremonies would take place. His role was crucial. If the earlier attempts failed, he would serve as one of the final opportunities to complete the mission. The weight of this responsibility pressed down on his young shoulders like a physical burden. Trifko Grabez, the teacher's son, waited near the Kaiser Bridge. He had traveled the furthest to be here, making the journey from his hometown of Pale. His family believed he was in Sarajevo for innocent student activities. They had no idea their son was prepared to commit regicide and throw away his life for a political cause they barely understood. And then there was Gavrilo Princip. The frail 19-year-old had taken his position near Schiller's Delicatessen on Franz Joseph Street, close to the Latin Bridge. Unlike the others, Princip showed no external signs of nervousness. His tubercular cough had been bothering him all morning, but his resolve remained unshakable. He had already attempted suicide once when rejected by the Austrian military for being too small and weak. Now, he would prove that size meant nothing when one's cause was just. Each assassin carried identical weapons: a Belgian-made Browning Model 1910 semi-automatic pistol and a bomb manufactured in the Serbian state arsenal. The bombs were crude but effective devices, roughly the size of a man's fist, filled with explosives and metal fragments. A percussion cap would detonate the device after a 10-second delay once the safety pin was removed. The coordination was remarkably sophisticated for such young conspirators. They had studied the published route, identified choke points where the motorcade would be forced to slow down, and positioned themselves to ensure overlapping fields of fire. If one failed, another would have the opportunity. If all failed, at least they would die knowing they had tried to strike a blow for freedom. What they didn't know was that Serbian intelligence had deliberately kept the Austrian authorities partially informed about potential threats. This was a delicate game. Serbia wanted the attempt to appear credible without actually succeeding, hoping to demonstrate the volatility of the region while avoiding the catastrophic consequences of actually killing the heir to the Austrian throne. But intelligence agencies, like conspiracies, rarely unfold according to plan. At 10:10 a.m., the sound of approaching automobile engines echoed off the stone buildings lining the Appel Quay. The moment had arrived. 6 young men prepared to step from the shadows of history into its blazing spotlight, each believing he was about to commit the most important act of his life. They had no idea they were about to trigger the most destructive war in human history. The roar of engines grew louder as Franz Ferdinand's motorcade turned onto the Appel Quay at exactly 10:15 a.m. 6 gleaming automobiles moved in formation through the heart of Sarajevo, their occupants waving to crowds that lined both sides of the broad boulevard. In the third car, the Archduke sat beside his wife Sophie, both smiling and acknowledging the surprisingly enthusiastic reception. Muhammad Mehmed Basic watched the approaching vehicles from his position near the Kamerja Bridge. The first car passed, then the second. As the Archduke's distinctive Graf stiff double phaeton came into view, Mehmed Basic's hand tightened around the bomb in his pocket. This was the moment he had trained for, planned for, dreamed of. All he needed to do was pull the pin, count to 10, and hurl the device into the open car. But his nerve failed him completely. Later, Mehmed Basic would claim that a policeman standing too close had made the attempt impossible. Others would suggest that the presence of so many innocent bystanders had given him pause. The truth was simpler and more human. When confronted with the reality of committing murder, the 27-year-old carpenter discovered he lacked the killer instinct that revolution demanded. The motorcade passed him by, and the first opportunity vanished into the Sarajevo morning. Nedeljko Kabranovic had no such hesitations. As the Archduke's car approached his position near the Austro-Hungarian bank, the young printer's hand moved with practiced precision. He withdrew the bomb from his coat, unscrewed the safety cap, and struck the percussion cap against a lamppost to activate the 10-second fuse. The metallic click was lost in the noise of engines and cheering crowds. Time seemed to slow as Kabranovic drew back his arm. Franz Ferdinand, resplendent in his blue military uniform with gold braiding, turned slightly in Kabranovic's direction. For a split second, the eyes of the assassin and his intended victim met across 20 feet of Sarajevo Street. Then Kabranovic hurled the bomb with all his strength. The explosive device arced through the morning air, a small black object carrying within it the power to change the world. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The Archduke's driver, Count Franz von Buchwaldeck, caught a glimpse of the projectile from the corner of his eye. Acting on pure instinct, he accelerated sharply just as the bomb struck the folded-back soft top of the convertible. Instead of landing in the passenger compartment, where it would have killed both Franz Ferdinand and Sophie instantly, the bomb bounced off the canvas roof and tumbled onto the street behind the moving car. The explosion came 10 seconds later. The blast was deafening, a thunderclap that shattered windows and sent shockwaves through the packed crowds. Metal fragments flew in all directions, and thick black smoke billowed up from the cobblestones. Screams replaced cheers as spectators threw themselves to the ground or fled in panic. The acrid smell of explosives filled the air, mixing with the dust and debris that rained down on the boulevard. In the fourth car, following directly behind the Archduke, Count Buchwaldeck's aide-de-camp, Colonel Erich von Maritzi, was struck in the head by a bomb fragment. Blood streamed down his face as he slumped forward, semi-conscious. Several spectators lay wounded on the sidewalk, victims of the metal shrapnel that had been packed into the crude device. But Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were unharmed. As the smoke cleared, the Archduke could be seen standing in his car, his uniform dusty but his bearing unshaken. He surveyed the carnage with the calm demeanor of a man who had served in the military and understood that violence was sometimes the price of leadership. Sophie, though shaken, remained composed beside her husband, her white dress now stained with dust and debris. Kabranovic, meanwhile, had swallowed his cyanide capsule immediately after throwing the bomb. But the poison was old and weak. Instead of dying heroically for the cause, he began vomiting violently on the riverbank. Before he could draw his pistol for a suicide attempt, angry bystanders and police officers were upon him, beating him mercilessly before dragging him away for interrogation. The motorcade, after a brief pause to assess the damage, continued toward the town hall. Franz Ferdinand insisted on proceeding with the planned itinerary despite the obvious danger. "So you welcome your guests with bombs?" he reportedly said to the Sarajevo mayor with characteristic Habsburg sarcasm. For assassins remained positioned along the route, their weapons still hidden, their mission still alive. But the element of surprise was gone, security would be heightened, and the chances of success had dramatically diminished. Or so it seemed. After the bombing attempt, the atmosphere in Sarajevo had transformed from celebration to barely controlled chaos. The planned ceremonies at the town hall proceeded, but tension crackled in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Franz Ferdinand, displaying the stoic courage expected of Habsburg royalty, insisted on continuing with the official program despite his security detail's urgent recommendations to leave the city immediately. The remaining 4 conspirators, Princip, Grabez, Popovich, and Kuberlovic, watched from their positions as news of Kabranovic's failed attempt spread through the crowds. Police presence had intensified dramatically, and suspicious-looking young men were being questioned throughout the city. The coordinated assassination plot was rapidly unraveling, yet none of the remaining assassins abandoned their posts. At the town hall, Franz Ferdinand participated in the formal speeches with characteristic Habsburg dignity, but his patience was wearing thin. When Sarajevo's mayor began reading a prepared address welcoming the Archduke to the city, Franz Ferdinand interrupted with barely controlled anger. "Mr. Mayor, one comes here for a visit and gets bombs thrown at one. It is outrageous." The mayor, flustered and embarrassed, stumbled through the remainder of his speech while the Archduke's security team huddled in urgent consultation. The original plan called for the motorcade to continue through the city center, visiting various civic buildings and allowing more opportunities for public appearances. But after the bombing, this route seemed like suicide. General Oskar Podgorek, the military governor of Bosnia-Herzegovina and Franz Ferdinand's host, faced an impossible decision. Canceling the visit entirely would be seen as a humiliating retreat in the face of terrorism. Continuing with the original route invited another assassination attempt. The compromise they settled on would prove to be the most consequential navigation error in human history. Sophie, the Archduke's wife, had remained remarkably composed throughout the morning's events. As they prepared to leave the town hall, she made a request that would seal their fate. She wanted to visit the hospital where the victims of the bombing had been taken, including Colonel Maritzi, who had been injured in their service. It was a gesture of compassion that reflected her character but would require another change to the planned route. The new plan seemed reasonable. Instead of continuing through the narrow streets of the old city where more assassins might be waiting, the motorcade would take the broader Appel Quay directly to the hospital, then proceed to the governor's residence for a private lunch. It was a sensible security decision that should have kept the royal couple away from the remaining conspirators. But in the confusion and haste of the replanning, a critical detail was overlooked. The drivers had not been properly informed of the route change. At 10:45 a.m., the motorcade departed the town hall. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie resumed their seats in the open Grafstift, still refusing the protection of a closed car despite the morning's events. The first 2 cars in the procession correctly followed the new route along the Appel Quay, staying close to the river where the streets were wide and sightlines were clear. But Count Franz von Bußwaldeck, driving the Archduke's car, had not received clear instructions about the change. When the motorcade reached the intersection of Appel Quay and Franz Joseph Street, he followed his original orders and turned right into the narrow street, heading directly toward the heart of the old city, and directly toward where Gavrilo Princip was waiting. General Podgorek, riding in the front passenger seat, immediately realized the error. "What is this?" he shouted. "This is the wrong way. We're supposed to take the Appel Quay." The driver, confused and flustered, brought the heavy automobile to a complete stop directly in front of Schiller's Delicatessen. As he attempted to shift into reverse, the engine stalled. For several crucial seconds, the future Emperor of Austria-Hungary sat motionless in an open car, a perfect target, while his driver frantically tried to restart the engine. Gavrilo Princip had been standing on the sidewalk outside the Delicatessen, having given up hope after the failed bombing and the route change. He had been contemplating how to return home to explain his failure to his handlers when fate delivered his target directly to him. The tubercular teenager stepped forward from the crowd, drawing his Browning pistol. At a distance of less than 6 feet, he could not possibly miss. Franz Ferdinand, still discussing the route error with General Podgorek, did not see the assassin approach. History balanced on the edge of a knife blade. A wrong turn had become destiny's design. At 10:50 a.m. on June 28, 1914, the world held its breath as a frail 19-year-old stepped out of the crowd on Franz Joseph Street. Gavrilo Princip, weighing barely 120 pounds and ravaged by tuberculosis, raised his Belgian Browning pistol with a steady hand that belied his physical weakness. The Archduke's car sat motionless directly in front of him, its engine silent, its occupants trapped by a mechanical failure that would echo through history. Franz Ferdinand, dressed in his ceremonial military uniform, sat exposed and vulnerable in the back seat. Beside him, Sophie wore her white dress and matching hat, the picture of Habsburg elegance, unaware that she had mere seconds to live. Princip later claimed that in that moment, he felt no hatred for the man before him, only an overwhelming sense that this was his destiny, his moment to strike a blow for Serbian independence. He had rehearsed this scenario countless times in his mind, but the reality was both simpler and more profound than his imagination had prepared him for. The first shot rang out at exactly 10:50 a.m. The bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. The impact threw the Archduke backward against the seat, his hand instinctively rising to his throat as blood began to flow between his fingers. He remained conscious but was already dying, his life ebbing away with each heartbeat that pumped precious blood from the fatal wound. Sophie, seeing her husband shot, instinctively threw herself across his body in a desperate attempt to shield him from further harm. It was an act of pure love that would cost her everything. The second shot came 3 seconds later. This bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen, tearing through vital organs and lodging deep in her body. She collapsed across her husband's lap, her white dress rapidly staining red with blood. Her final words, barely audible above the chaos erupting around them, were directed to Franz Ferdinand. "In heaven's name, what has happened to you?" The Archduke, his voice growing weaker as blood continued to flow from his neck wound, looked down at his dying wife and whispered, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." These would be among his final coherent words. The entire sequence, 2 shots that would ultimately claim 37 million lives, had taken less than 10 seconds. Chaos exploded across Franz Joseph Street. General Podiorex shouted orders that no one could hear above the screaming of panicked spectators. Count Buchwaldek, the driver, finally managed to restart the engine and accelerated toward the governor's residence, unaware that his passengers were already beyond medical help. Princip, meanwhile, had turned his pistol on himself, attempting suicide as he had been instructed. But before he could pull the trigger, angry bystanders swarmed over him. A coffee shop owner named Franz Delicatny struck the assassin with a chair, while others in the crowd began beating him mercilessly. Police officers arrived within moments, forming a protective circle around Princip, not to save his life, but to prevent the mob from killing him before he could be properly interrogated. As they dragged him away, Princip was heard to shout, "I am a Serbian hero!" Blood streamed from his nose and mouth, but his eyes blazed with the fervor of a man who believed he had just changed history. He had no idea how right he was. The Archduke's car reached the governor's residence within minutes, but it was already too late. Sophie died first, her life slipping away as servants carried her into the building. Franz Ferdinand survived another 10 minutes, long enough for a priest to administer last rites and for him to murmur a final prayer for his children, Charles, Maximilian, and Ernst, who would now grow up without either parent. At 11:30 a.m., exactly 40 minutes after the shooting, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was pronounced dead. The heir to one of Europe's great empires had been felled by 2 bullets fired by a tubercular teenager who believed he was striking a blow for freedom. News of the assassination spread across Europe with unprecedented speed, carried by telegraph wires that connected every major capital. In Vienna, Emperor Franz Joseph received the news with stoic resignation. He had outlived his son Rudolf to suicide, his wife Elizabeth to assassination, and now his nephew and heir to terrorist violence. In Belgrade, government officials who had secretly supported the Black Hand began to realize the magnitude of the catastrophe they had unleashed. But it was in the coffee houses and government offices across the continent that the most ominous reactions began to form. Diplomats spoke in hushed tones of honor and revenge, of alliance obligations and military preparations. The complex web of treaties that had maintained European peace for decades suddenly seemed less like insurance policies and more like fuses waiting to be lit. 2 shots in Sarajevo had shattered more than 2 lives. They had shattered the peace of the world. The coffee shop owner's chair had cracked across Gavrilo Princip's skull with the sound of splintering wood, but the young assassin felt no pain. Adrenaline and revolutionary fervor had transformed the frail teenager into something beyond physical sensation. As police officers dragged him through the angry crowd towards Sarajevo's central station, Princip's tuberculosis-ravaged lungs fought for air, yet his voice rang out clearly. Long live Serbia! Long live the South Slavs! The mob that surrounded him bayed for blood with a fury that surprised even the hardened police officers. These were not political extremists, but ordinary citizens of Sarajevo, shopkeepers, clerks, housewives, who had witnessed the brutal murder of their future emperor and his wife. They clawed at Princip's clothes, spat in his face, and would have torn him apart with their bare hands if not for the protective ring of uniforms that surrounded him. Detective Inspector Anton Vasic, a veteran investigator with the Sarajevo police, took personal charge of the prisoner. As they reached the station, Vasic ordered his men to clear the building of all non-essential personnel. What was about to unfold would require absolute secrecy, for the implications extended far beyond a simple murder case. In the interrogation room, Princip was chained to a chair, his clothes torn and bloodied from the crowd's assault. But his eyes remained defiant, burning with the conviction that he had struck a blow for justice. When offered medical attention for his injuries, he refused, stating that a Serbian patriot needed no Austrian mercy. The questioning began at 2:30 p.m., less than 4 hours after the assassination. Inspector Vasic had decades of experience breaking criminals, but he had never encountered anyone quite like Gavrilo Princip. Most murderers, when faced with the reality of their crime, showed remorse, fear, or at least self-preservation instincts. Princip showed none of these human weaknesses. "Why did you do it?" Vasic asked in his first question. Princip's response was immediate and unwavering. "I wanted to take revenge, and I regret nothing." As the hours passed, a disturbing picture emerged from the interrogation. This was no lone madman acting on impulse, but a carefully recruited and trained assassin who represented something far more dangerous, an organized conspiracy with international connections. Princip readily admitted his membership in various nationalist organizations, his training with weapons, and his belief that violence was justified in the struggle for South Slavic independence. But when pressed for details about his handlers, his sources of weapons, and the broader network that had supported the assassination, Princip's responses became evasive. He had been well prepared for capture and interrogation. The Black Hands training had included instruction on how to resist questioning, while revealing just enough information to appear cooperative. "I am a Yugoslav nationalist," he stated during one particularly intense session. "I wanted to free the Yugoslavs, for I am a Yugoslav. As such, I want to take revenge, and I'm not sorry about it." The interrogators brought in Nedeljko Kabranovic, the failed bomber who had been captured earlier. Confronted with his fellow conspirator, Princip showed no emotion, no recognition, no hint of surprise. It was as if he had been trained to expect this exact scenario. The 2 young men, both facing certain death, maintained a discipline that impressed even their captors. As news of the assassination spread beyond Sarajevo, pressure mounted on the investigators to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. Telegraph messages poured in from Vienna, demanding answers about Serbian involvement. The Austrian government needed to know whether this was a random act of terrorism or an act of war orchestrated by foreign power. Under relentless questioning, some details emerged. The weapons had come from Serbia. The training had taken place across the border. There were others involved, a network of supporters, safe houses, and sympathizers who had made the assassination possible. But the deeper connections to Serbian intelligence services and the Black Hand remained hidden behind layers of operational security. Dr. Leon Thaler, a psychiatrist brought in to evaluate the assassin's mental state, found Princip to be completely sane and rational. He shows no signs of mental illness, Thaler reported. His actions were the product of political fanaticism, not psychological disorder. He knew exactly what he was doing and understood the consequences of his actions. Perhaps most chilling was Princip's complete lack of remorse for Sophie's death. When confronted with the fact that he had killed an innocent woman, a mother of 3 children, he showed no emotion whatsoever. "I did not aim at her," he stated flatly. "She got in the way of my bullet intended for the Archduke." As the interrogation stretched into its 3rd day, Inspector Vasic realized he was facing something unprecedented in his career. This was not a criminal in any conventional sense, but a soldier in an undeclared war, a war that was about to become very much declared. The young man chained to the chair had no idea that his 2 shots had already set in motion a diplomatic crisis that would soon engulf all of Europe in flames. In the elegant halls of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, Emperor Franz Joseph sat in stunned silence as his advisors delivered the news that would reshape the world. The 84-year-old monarch had ruled the Austro-Hungarian Empire for 66 years, surviving wars, revolutions, and personal tragedies that would have broken lesser men. But the assassination of his nephew and heir struck him with a force that transcended mere politics. "So, the Slavs have finally done it," the emperor said quietly, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he set down the telegram from Sarajevo. The man who had once been called the last knight of European monarchy seemed to age a decade in that moment, understanding instinctively that this was not merely another Balkan incident, but the beginning of something catastrophic. Within hours of Franz Ferdinand's death, the machinery of European diplomacy began grinding toward war with terrifying momentum. In the Austrian Foreign Ministry, Count Leopold Berchtold convened an emergency session with military leaders and government officials. The consensus was unanimous and ominous. Serbia must pay for this outrage, regardless of the consequences. General Konrad von Hotzendorf, the Austrian chief of staff, had been advocating for a preventive war against Serbia for years. Now, with the Archduke's blood still fresh on Sarajevo's cobblestones, he saw his opportunity. "This is our chance to crush the Serbian viper once and for all," he declared to the assembled ministers. "Every day we delay gives them more time to prepare and their Russian protectors more time to intervene." But Austria-Hungary could not act alone. The empire's military was already stretched thin managing its restive minorities and defending its lengthy borders. Any move against Serbia would almost certainly trigger Russian intervention, and that meant invoking the alliance system that had kept Europe in precarious balance for decades. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II received news of the assassination while sailing aboard his yacht in the Baltic Sea. The impetuous German emperor had been Franz Ferdinand's friend and was genuinely shocked by the murder. But beyond personal grief lay cold political calculation. Germany's blank check to Austria, a promise of unconditional support in any conflict with Serbia, would prove to be one of history's most consequential diplomatic decisions. "Austria must be supported against Serbia," Wilhelm declared to his advisors. "If Russia intervenes, then we shall fight Russia as well." The German Empire stands by its allies. What the Kaiser failed to grasp was that supporting Austria against Serbia meant potentially fighting Russia, France, and Britain simultaneously, a prospect that even Germany's formidable military machine might not survive. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II faced an impossible choice. Russia had positioned itself as the protector of Slavic peoples in the Balkans, and abandoning Serbia to Austrian vengeance would represent a humiliating retreat that could destabilize his already shaky regime. Yet mobilizing against Austria meant invoking the Franco-Russian alliance and potentially triggering a continental war that could destroy his empire. The Russian foreign minister, Sergei Sazonov, understood the stakes perfectly. If Austria annexes Serbia, he warned the Tsar, Russia's prestige in the Balkans will be irreparably damaged. But if we support Serbia militarily, we face the possibility of general European war. It was a choice between humiliation and catastrophe, with no middle ground visible. In Paris, President Raymond Poincaré and his ministers watched events unfold with growing alarm. France's alliance with Russia was the cornerstone of its security policy, designed to prevent German hegemony in Europe. But supporting Russia in a Balkan conflict meant facing the combined might of Germany and Austria-Hungary, a prospect that filled even the most hawkish French politicians with dread. The British government, meanwhile, initially viewed the crisis as another tiresome Balkan dispute that civilized nations should settle through diplomacy. Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey proposed mediation, international conferences, and cooling-off periods, the traditional tools of British diplomacy. What Grey failed to understand was that this crisis had already moved beyond the realm where traditional diplomacy could function. As July progressed, each government found itself trapped by the logic of the alliance system. Austria felt compelled to punish Serbia to maintain its credibility as a great power. Russia felt obligated to support Serbia to preserve its Balkan influence. Germany felt bound to support Austria to maintain its only reliable ally. France felt committed to support Russia to prevent German domination. And Britain felt increasingly drawn towards supporting France and Russia to maintain the balance of power. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. The ultimatum that Austria delivered to Serbia on July 23rd was deliberately designed to be unacceptable. Its demands included allowing Austrian officials to participate directly in the investigation of anti-Austrian activities on Serbian soil, a violation of sovereignty that no independent nation could accept while maintaining its dignity. Serbia's response on July 25th was a masterpiece of diplomatic maneuvering, accepting most demands while subtly rejecting the most humiliating provisions. Under normal circumstances, this might have provided a face-saving compromise for all parties. But these were not normal circumstances. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after Gavrilo Princip fired his 2 fatal shots, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The first domino had fallen, and the others would follow with inexorable logic over the next week. The terrorist attack by a tubercular teenager had become the spark that ignited the powder keg of European politics. On October 12, 1914, as the first battles of the Great War raged across Europe, a different kind of warfare began in Sarajevo's courthouse. The trial of Gavrilo Princip and his fellow conspirators opened amid unprecedented security, with the defendants facing not merely justice, but the full weight of an empire's fury and a continent's grief. The courtroom had been transformed into a fortress. Armed guards lined every wall, sharpshooters positioned themselves at strategic points, and metal detectors, a revolutionary security innovation, screened every person entering the building. The Austrian authorities were taking no chances with the men who had plunged Europe into its bloodiest conflict. Judge Leo Pfeffer, a veteran jurist known for his meticulous attention to legal procedure, presided over what would become one of the most politically charged trials in European history. 25 defendants sat in the dock, ranging from the primary conspirators to peripheral supporters who had provided safe houses, weapons, or simply moral encouragement to the assassination plot. Gavrilo Princip, now 4 months older but visibly deteriorated by his tuberculosis and the harsh conditions of his imprisonment, sat calmly in the center of the dock. The young man who had changed the course of world history appeared almost skeletal, his clothes hanging loosely on his emaciated frame. Yet his eyes remained defiant, burning with the same revolutionary fervor that had driven him to pull the trigger on that fateful June morning. The prosecution, led by Chief Prosecutor Rudolf Zisler, faced an unusual challenge. The evidence against the defendants was overwhelming. They had readily confessed to their crimes and showed no remorse for their actions. But Austria-Hungary needed more than simple convictions. They needed to prove Serbian government involvement to justify the war that was already consuming Europe. These men were not mere terrorists, Zisler declared in his opening statement, but agents of a foreign power trained and equipped by the Serbian state to commit regicide and provoke war. They are the instruments of a conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of the Serbian government. The defense attorney, Rudolf Sissler, ironically sharing almost the same name as his prosecutorial opponent, faced an impossible task. His clients had committed their crimes in full view of dozens of witnesses and had confessed freely. Austrian law provided no death penalty for minors, which saved several of the youngest conspirators, but the older defendants faced certain execution. Sissler's strategy was audacious in its simplicity. He would argue that his clients were idealistic patriots fighting against foreign oppression, not criminals deserving death. It was a dangerous gambit in a courtroom filled with Austrian officials, but it reflected the broader propaganda war being fought across Europe. When called to testify, Princip showed no trace of the nervous teenager who had once been rejected by the Austrian army for being too weak. Prison had hardened him into something approaching a political philosopher, and his testimony became a manifesto of South Slavic nationalism. "I am a Yugoslav nationalist," he declared from the witness stand, his voice carrying clearly across the packed courtroom. "I aim to free the Yugoslavs. For I am a Yugoslav. I wanted to take revenge, and I regret nothing." The judge pressed him on the death of Sophie, the innocent woman whose only crime had been loving her husband. Princip's response chilled even hardened court observers. "I did not intend to kill the Duchess. She threw herself across the Archduke to protect him. I'm sorry about her death, but I am not responsible for it." Nedeljko Kabranovic, the failed bomber, proved even more unrepentant than Princip. When asked about his motivations, he launched into a passionate speech about Austrian oppression and Serbian liberation that had to be cut short by the judge. "We are Serbs," he shouted before being silenced. "We love our people, and we shall die for our people." The trial became a stage for competing narratives about nationalism, terrorism, and the nature of political violence. The prosecution painted the defendants as foreign agents committing acts of war against a legitimate government. The defense portrayed them as freedom fighters resisting colonial occupation. Both narratives contained elements of truth, making the trial as much about politics as law. Testimony revealed the sophisticated network that had made the assassination possible. Witnesses described the weapons training in Belgrade, the smuggling routes across the Serbian border, and the safe houses that had sheltered the conspirators. But the deeper connections to Serbian intelligence services remained murky, protected by operational security and the defendants' disciplined silence. The most damning evidence came from captured documents and intercepted communications that seemed to implicate Serbian officials in the plot. However, the authenticity of some evidence was questionable, and defense attorneys argued that Austria had manufactured or manipulated documents to justify its war aims. As the trial progressed through the autumn of 1914, news from the battlefields provided a grim backdrop to the legal proceedings. The war that had begun with Austria's declaration against Serbia had metastasized into a continental catastrophe. Millions of men were already fighting and dying from the English Channel to the Russian steppes, all because of the events that were being dissected in minute detail in this Sarajevo courtroom. The verdict, when it came on October 28th, surprised no one. Gavrilo Princip, Nedeljko Kabranovic, and Trifko Grabez were sentenced to 20 years in prison, the maximum penalty allowed for minors under Austrian law. The older conspirators received death sentences that would be carried out within months. But the trial's true significance lay not in its verdicts, but in its demonstration of how easily political violence could spiral beyond anyone's control or intention. On November 1st, 1918, exactly 4 years and 4 months after Gavrilo Princip pulled his trigger in Sarajevo, the tubercular assassin died alone in his prison cell at their Seinstadt fortress. His body, ravaged by disease and the harsh conditions of Austrian captivity, had finally succumbed to the tuberculosis that had been slowly killing him since adolescence. He was 23 years old. Princip died never knowing the true magnitude of what his 2 shots had unleashed upon the world. By the time of his death, the war to end all wars was finally grinding to its blood-soaked conclusion. The armistice would be signed in 11 days, but the accounting of devastation was already staggering beyond human comprehension. 37 million military and civilian casualties. For empires destroyed, entire generations of young men wiped from the earth, cities reduced to rubble, economies shattered, societies transformed beyond recognition. The assassination that was supposed to liberate the South Slavs had instead created the greatest catastrophe in human history to that point. The war's opening moves had followed the script that European generals had been rehearsing for decades. Austria-Hungary's declaration of war against Serbia on July 28, 1914, had triggered the alliance system like a row of dominoes falling in predetermined sequence. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia to support Austria. France honored its alliance with Russia. Germany invaded Belgium to attack France, bringing Britain into the conflict. Within 6 weeks of the Sarajevo assassination, most of Europe was at war. What no one had anticipated was how the conflict would evolve. The generals had planned for a short, decisive campaign, 6 months at most. Instead, they got 4 years of industrialized slaughter that consumed men and resources at rates that defied all previous military experience. The Western Front became a 450-mile scar across Europe, a maze of trenches and barbed wire where millions of soldiers faced each other across a few hundred yards of cratered wasteland. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, British forces suffered 60,000 casualties in a single day, more than the entire population of Sarajevo. At Verdun, French and German armies bled each other white in a 10-month battle that became a symbol of the war's mindless brutality. The Eastern Front saw entire armies annihilated in forgotten battles whose casualty figures exceeded the populations of major cities. Technology had outpaced human wisdom, creating weapons of unprecedented lethality. Machine guns could mow down attacking infantry in seconds. Artillery barges could be heard from hundreds of miles away. Poison gas drifted across battlefields like yellow death, suffocating soldiers in their own trenches. For the first time in history, the capacity to destroy had exceeded the capacity to create. The political consequences proved equally catastrophic. The Russian Empire collapsed in revolution, giving birth to the Soviet Union and decades of communist tyranny. The German Empire fell, creating conditions for the rise of Adolf Hitler and an even more devastating Second World War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the very entity that Princip had sought to wound, disintegrated entirely, fragmenting into successor states that would spend the next century fighting over the pieces. The Ottoman Empire, drawn into the conflict on Germany's side, met a similar fate. Its collapse created the modern Middle East, with artificial borders and competing nationalisms that continue to generate conflict more than a century later. Even the victorious powers, Britain, France, and Italy, emerged from the war economically exhausted and politically destabilized. Ironically, Princip's dream of Yugoslav unity was partially realized in the war's aftermath. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia was created from the ruins of Austria-Hungary, uniting Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and other South Slavic peoples under a single crown. But this artificial state, born from the violence that Princip had initiated, would prove unstable and would eventually tear itself apart in another series of brutal wars in the 1990s. The young man who had believed he was striking a blow for freedom had instead demonstrated the terrible unpredictability of political violence. His carefully planned assassination had triggered a chain reaction that no one could control, predict, or stop once it began. The war to end all wars had instead created conditions for an even more devastating conflict 20 years later. Perhaps most tragically, the values that Princip claimed to champion, national self-determination, freedom from oppression, dignity for small peoples, were among the first casualties of the war he had sparked. The conflict brutalized entire societies, normalized violence as a political tool, and created precedents for state-sponsored mass killing that would echo through the 20th century. In the end, 2 shots fired by a tubercular teenager on a sunny morning in Sarajevo had shattered not just 2 lives, but the entire framework of European civilization. The old world of empires and monarchies, of diplomatic balance and civilized warfare, died with Franz Ferdinand and Sophie on that June day in 1914. What emerged from the rubble was a new world. More democratic perhaps, but also more violent, more ideological, and more willing to sacrifice individual lives for abstract political goals. It was a world that Gavrilo Princip, dying forgotten in his Austrian prison cell, had helped to create but would never understand. The mystery was not who killed the Archduke, but how two shots could kill a civilization. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking.